All right, so I'm gonna do another audio podcast here. I want to thank those who have been listening and encourage you to share it any way you can. Unfortunately, because of my time schedule, I am not able to share it in as many places as I used to, but I'll try to do it more often so that I can increase access. But my recommendation is share it to people direct, Telegram, text message, whatever way you can, because on most social media platforms it is censored. Of course, I am excluding platforms like Gab, Telegram, and Minds. Now, to get to the topic today, one of the reasons that people are very reluctant to really put themselves out there and fight for the issues that are important to them is that they're afraid that being tied to this belief that they have will taint their reputation with the people in the surrounding community, because while they think that many people will probably agree with them, they don't believe that this activism label, this activist label, this idea that you are actually pounding the pavement, that it is something that is actually, virtuous, because people don't like to be solicited, especially people on the right wing part of the spectrum. They don't like to be solicited daily with things that are in their face. And I encountered that specifically when I was doing door knocking last year. I actually did door knocking for the Trump campaign, and there was a guy who I think he was even a Donald Trump supporter, who said to me, well, shouldn't you just get like a real job or something? And the fact is that at the time I did have a real job. I just didn't do it during regular working hours. So it was pretty frustrating for me, also because for many years I had that attitude, which is that you don't actually accomplish anything by being involved in your own personal life with these campaigns or anything. Now, I will say that there are many campaigns that I do think are futile, and I think that there's also many causes that are put out there by the media that don't really have grassroots support, if I can call it grassroots. And I should be the first one to say that you should really check whether the cause that you are volunteering for is supported by real community members, or if it is largely led by organizations that sit in the shadows and propel them. And my personal experience was, a couple of years ago I started to investigate a group of organizations called the Momentum Community, and they included, if you haven't heard about them, it's likely that you have not heard about them because nobody really cares, but they were blasted around by the media as these great youth activists, the Sunrise Movement, and they had another couple affiliated movements called Kosecha, and also If Not Now. And these movements are basically governed and led really by a central group. The only difference is that at local levels, all they have is basically a branch, or you could even call it a franchise, and it's largely a joke, and it's hollowed out in the middle. So why am I talking about this today? Well, the fact is that we are seeing an increase in groups of people who go to public events and they put on spectacles and they wave their banners and they engage in chants such as F Joe Biden. There was the very interesting group that over the weekend went to a Staten Island food court and patronized it, even though there's a vaccine mandate, and said, hey, we're going to break the mandate, we're going to bring people in, and they got a chant going. So what am I trying to say here in terms of the effectiveness of it? Well, the reality is that the people who are often another leg on the stool of the regime, of the people at the top, the establishment, the government, they are the enforcers, right? So the three-legged stool, okay, I'm kind of improvising this right now. The three-legged stool has to consist of those that comply, those that enforce, and those that simply sit by and do nothing, right? And those that comply are typically people who are staunch supporters, but they're not really willing to do anything actively that that would endanger themselves. The enforcers are the people who are willing to use their authority in order to put down the group that is the third group, which is the people who sit by idly and do nothing because they're hoping things are going to get better, and it doesn't get better, which means that the group that has to be taken out in terms of attitude has to be those that sit idly by. How do you take them out? Well, if it's a rickety leg, then the stool is unstable. You can't really sit on it if it starts to get loose and things like that. So and on top of the stool, of course, is the people that direct the three legs below. So this is really an issue that everybody can affect, because in reality, within all three of the legs of the stool, there is the basic leg, which is the third leg, the people who sit idly by and watch things happen. If you look at most people in society, they're not willing to go too far in order to inconvenience themselves for something they believe in. Now, there are special people that are out there, both good and bad, that are willing to really take tremendous sacrifices in order to accomplish what they're talking about. But the vast majority of people are basically all talk, and they can't actually live by the words that they're talking about. And look, everybody I think has their limit. I don't think that you can classify yourself as one of these selfless true believers until you've actually done something that you sacrifice for. And I think people go in some cases from one group to the other. They go from being an enforcer to being one of the people who is in the resistance, the people who are bringing the third leg down. And I was actually watching this week. Sometimes I like to watch the older History Channel documentaries, which I think were more informative, and at least they would raise some questions, even if you didn't necessarily think that the main thrust of the program was complete or whatever. So I was watching a program this week about German or pro-German collaborators during World War II. And it's an interesting comparison. I don't want to make a direct comparison, but I think it is appropriate to talk about the theme of collaborators in wartime. And people get accused of collaboration all the time because a collaboration was actually, the term collaboration was more properly coined by the French in World War II. And initially it wasn't supposed to be something negative. What had happened was that France was just utterly defeated by the Germans at the beginning of World War II, when the Germans invaded the Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, and outflanked the French Maginot Line. And while there were many French who fought bravely and were killed, the majority of French people, as is the stereotype, unfortunately, and the French soldiers, they threw down their arms and surrendered to the Germans because there was just no chance. The French had proven themselves to be the paper tiger, if there ever was one, during that war, or at least during the beginning of World War II. Later they would somewhat redeem themselves, as we'll talk about soon. And the person who was put in charge of France in order to shepherd it through the period of German occupation right after the defeat was none other than the Marshal Philippe Pétain, who is well known before that as a World War I hero, one of the more inspirational figures in French history. And his premise was that in order to keep the French people safe, in order to prevent them from being basically abused and crushed into oblivion by the Germans, they would have to create a collaboration with the Germans, right? And in this endeavor, originally Pétain was striving to do as little as possible and trying to just basically satisfy the Germans in the hopes of having them eventually withdraw their troops and allow France to continue with some semblance of more independence. It might have to come through territorial concessions. It might have to come through other, incentives for the Germans. But he had a raw deal to begin with, and he had people that he had to lean on, such as his Prime Minister Pierre Laval, who was more well known as a more active collaborator. And that's really where it diverged, because what I'm talking about here, there are people like Pétain nowadays that say, well, I'm going to go along with these mandates, with these directives, because I can't afford to have my life become too compromised and too uncomfortable and jeopardize my career, my future, my children's future, the future of the family around me or associates or my spouse or whatever. I can't afford to do that. And while I disagree or have some sort of reservation about what's going on, I can't afford to actually say no. And I would say that the majority of Americans, if you look proportionally, fit into this category. They have reservations about this, but they can't really see a way to avoid complying, because it will affect them financially, perhaps through their school, perhaps through their community. There's many different pressures that people feel. And there are countries, for example, I have family in Israel, I have friends in Israel, that it's even more extreme, that virtually everyone is of the same mind. They say, well, this is what we have to do as a country. We have to come together and do this. In fact, one of the things I hear is, the main refrain isn't, this vaccine is going to make us better. It is that this is the situation. What else can we do? So, unfortunately, the majority of people are of this mindset. And on top of that, you do have people who are like the second figure that I mentioned, Pierre Laval, who are more proactive, and they say, well, the truth is that we can't just passively support. We can't just passively support this or comply. We have to actively be a part of this in order to get through this, because otherwise we're never going to get through that type of, this tragic situation. And Laval, at one point in this documentary that I watched, he actually went and said wrote in an op-ed that he had published to the French people that he hopes for a German victory, largely because he hoped that it would not only protect France, but it would create a better France. And this is something that is, I would say, the mindset of the ruling classes in most of the countries that we're talking about, such as New Zealand, Australia, the UK, France, the United States, Israel, which is that it's the Build Back Better mentality. The old reality, which is pre-2020, where people were able to circulate freely and have their own opinions and discuss science in a more free way and discuss all manner of topics with relative comfort, that can't come back because society has to come together at this moment, at this pivotal transition point, and decide whether it wants to survive or not. And that's the illusion that they create, which is that we can't go back to the old reality because that old reality allowed this danger to occur. We have to embrace this new reality and you know, run with it. People like Rochelle Walensky, the head of the CDC, are propagating this mentality. People like Anthony Fauci, and I think his name is Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health. They are of the mentality that the COVID crisis has come, and the solution has to be to embrace this sort of lifestyle in order to really, you know, look at society from a overhead perspective and try to direct it for public health purposes. Meanwhile, you do see there are more people who are suffering because of the coronavirus crisis, but not because of COVID itself. There are more cases. For example, in Syracuse, there is a hospital that has shut down the majority of its operating rooms for surgeries because it can't staff them. It can't staff them with people who have complied with the vaccine mandates. And you're seeing this also in other hospitals in upstate New York. There are talks of staffing some of these hospitals with National Guardsmen. And even here in Ohio, where I live, there are attempts to do what they did in Massachusetts, which is to get National Guardsmen to drive buses, because a lot of bus drivers have basically ditched their job, or in some cases they actually are sick. So I'm not going to diminish the fact that, yeah, there are people with health problems, and I'm not saying that you can't contract the virus if you have some sort of vulnerability. I believe Jason Whitlock this weekend, maybe it was last week, he had an interview with Dave Rubin, and Jason Whitlock said that it is entirely inappropriate that the government, while it approves this vaccine, it says that a vaccine that is designed for people like him, who's in his 50s, he's chronically overweight and unhealthy, he actually does need the vaccine. It is irresponsible for the government to mandate that people who are 25 years old and in perfect health or above average health, or even at average health, have to take the same medication, because people's individual health situation is very, very nuanced, right? And many people are of the mindset that, no, I'm not going to make a big fuss. I'm just going to go along and get it. It's definitely a mistake, in my opinion. You have to generally make the best choice you can for yourself, not for the greater society. And what I'm moving towards was also discussed in the documentary. It was a History Channel documentary about Pierre Laval, which is that as the war went on, okay, and conditions changed. So at the beginning, people like Laval were considered to be, in some cases, heroic, because Laval was, for example, Pierre Laval was able to get the Germans to return tens of thousands of French POWs to France in exchange for what were called at the time guest workers. They would come to Germany in order to man the machines in in German wartime industries and factories, and Laval was only happy to put those people there. I think maybe Germany also would provide them with monetary compensation for that to the French. I mean, the French government. So basically, Laval was able to get POWs returned. He was able to get parts of France to live a normal life for a temporary amount of time. But as the war wore on, and Germany itself made a number of strategic blunders and lost control of North Africa, they failed to successfully subdue the British, and eventually France became vulnerable to invasion. The Germans had to crack down even harder in France, because there was a real resistance movement that kept causing major problems for the Germans, and even causing casualties through bombings and other actions. So Laval, because he knew that his entire reason for being in power, and so he's above the three legs of the stool. He is basically the stool cover on which the the ass is sitting. So Laval knew that he needs to enforce his rule, or else he's going to be swept away, because the only thing legitimizing his rule is the downward pressure from above, which is the German government and military sitting on top of his regime. So what he ended up doing was, thanks to German pressure, creating a new militia of thugs that would go and harass people, and basically, and for example, they would arrest people, have them deported to Germany, whether they were Jewish or whether they were simply undesirables as defined by German and French collaborator definitions. The French collaborationist regime, by the way, is called the Vichy Regime. It's well known in World War II, Vichy, and they sat in exile from Paris in this small resort town of Vichy in southern central France. So basically Laval became more and more abusive because he had to become abusive, because it became more difficult to enforce the mandates of his regime, because people were starting to realize that the Germans were under tremendous pressure. The Germans had to invade the Vichy portion of France in 1943 in order to safeguard against Allied invasion from North Africa, because the Germans had lost control of North Africa. The Vichy government had lost control of all of the French possessions in Africa and in the Middle East and in East Asia. So basically the noose was tightening around them. So essentially people at home started to realize that this government, while originally it was the only choice, it was also a very temporary choice. The choice of collaboration in that case, while it looked like it might have to be for a very long time, it now seemed to be much more limited, because the Germans could not safeguard their collaborators. So once France was actually invaded by the Allies in 1944, during the D-Day invasion, June 6, 1944, at Normandy, the French collaborators were basically, the stool kept getting more and more rickety. There were less people complying, so the third leg was basically disappearing, and the enforcement leg, the second leg of the stool, the second leg of the stool, which is those people who were sitting idly by and doing nothing, more and more of them were not complying, and then that group of people, the people who were actively supporting the collaborators because they hoped to be more well treated, even though they had misgivings about it, they were becoming less and less as well. And finally, the enforcers, which are the primary leg, the enforcement leg, they were also diminishing. And in the documentary, it actually quotes a man who had been a collaborationist police officer. His reason for becoming a police officer under the Vichy government was that it would exclude him from military service, meaning that he did not want to actually be put on the front lines if necessary in a place like North Africa, where the French collaborationists still had military forces and potentially have to fight other French on the battlefield, or the British or the Americans. So there were people who were active enforcers, and in his case he said that while he did know that he was arresting, in many cases, people and putting them at the French detainment camps like Drancy and I forget what the other one was called in France, he claims that he was unaware that many of them were destined to be exterminated. However, towards the end of the war, he did become a part of the resistance by forging documents or actually issuing fake documents to people and helping people to evade the very police force that he was a part of. And in such a way, the French Vichy government collapsed, because while there can exist a government for many years that is oppressing the people below it, if its own machinery doesn't function in order to preserve it, it can't actually sustain itself. And once the Allies had actually approached Paris, the entire city rebelled and expelled the German occupiers, including many of the French police officers that had until then been the most active supporters of the Germans and had helped them accomplish much of their mission, which was to occupy and suppress any resistance to German subjugation. So finally, the collaborators had to retreat from France into exile in Germany to the town called Sigmaringen. It's an interesting story, but that's really where it sort of ends for all intents and purposes. The main message I'm trying to tell you here is that, yes, there are going to be people who will antagonize you and try to tell you that you're endangering society and that you can't be trusted because you're wrong and you're not scientific and you don't care about the greater good, you don't care about society, you don't care about saving lives. But as the illusion goes on, as the occupation and repression goes on, just like with the Vichy French, the choice that they're offering becomes more and more illogical, and people start to realize that while they hope that this would make their lives easier, it isn't becoming easier. It's not becoming easier because people are not actually enjoying any level of comfort better than what they would be if they were resisting. And that's becoming a reality here. And you are seeing that because of these vaccine mandates here in the US, you're seeing, first of all, people who work in core positions, such as school bus drivers, which people don't really think about, but school bus drivers are, in a sense, essential to the education system so long as you have people attending school in person, having kids attend school in person. Otherwise, you have to hire Uber drivers, and they've thought about hiring Uber drivers. At that point, does it become mandatable that Uber drivers are going to take the vaccine? I don't know if that will help either. You might see Uber get into a huge mess if that happens. I don't know whether Uber has. And beyond that, you also have people in hospitals and operating rooms that are no longer being, they've walked away from their jobs. They've said, no, this is not important enough that we're going to compromise our health in order to enforce your mandates. We're not going to let, so people have a limit. Even people who, until a certain point, are very much gung-ho. Until there are many people who they realize that once they have to actually sacrifice for it, they will not sacrifice for it, and their collaboration ends because they realize that it's not really a cause that they feel they have conviction for. And then you are going to see, in my opinion, and you're already seeing the beginnings of it, but you're going to see much more prominently than enforcers start to walk away from enforcement. So you do have police officers who decide not to enforce the vaccine mandates, like the mask mandates as well, or closings. And what we're going to see, I think, with these National Guardsmen staffing some of these facilities is that that's going to cause a major meltdown within the National Guard. Why would that happen? And why is it, I think, going to be very obvious with the National Guard? Well, people don't sign up for the National Guard in order to be in the service all the time. The National Guard is supposed to be 1 week in a month. You're supposed to basically be able to have your own job during the rest of the year, during the rest of the month. And it's largely from people who, yes, they're willing to, sacrifice personally if needed for a cause such as going to defend the country or going to relieve a particular area during disaster, like they do in the Gulf whenever there's a hurricane. However, if they have to drive a bus around for weeks on end because of a vaccine mandate, and many of them might have friends or neighbors who also had to suffer because of the vaccine mandate, or they have other people within the National Guard who left the National Guard in order to not have to comply with the vaccine mandate, you will see, in my opinion, both retirements from the National Guard, perhaps even desertions from the National Guard, and that would be a major crisis in the country, and I think it would lead to the military seriously telling Biden that the vaccine mandate has to end, or else they will that there will be an institutional failure. And at that point, people have to remember that the institution is really what these people are trying to maintain. They're not supporting Biden for the sake of supporting Biden, and they're not supporting the vaccine mandate necessarily for the sake of itself either. The idea of it is that they want greater control, but if it's leading to less control, if it's leading actually to more chaos and more difficulty in maintaining control, many of these people who previously supported it will probably switch because they know that they've seen the fruits of their deeds. I'm not talking about people who actually want chaos. I'm talking about those that think that the solution would work, okay? So separate out people who might have ill intent, and I'm talking about those who are, up until now, active supporters. And people want to think that Biden is the be-all, end-all of this, or somebody at the top, whether it's Barack Obama or whoever. The reality is that the institution itself will outlive the people who are its biggest standard bearers or its figureheads. So people think that in a totalitarian regime, it has to be something where you have a central figure like Mao or Kim Jong-un, who is worshipped by the masses. It's not necessarily true. It actually is very useful because you can have a unifying figure, but you have to remember, this is where Biden comes in. There were leaders of the Soviet Union who were removed from office simply because the leadership felt that they weren't in that their position, their holding of the position, didn't serve the leadership's purpose. So if you look up old Soviet leaders, you have, for example, Constantine Shernenko, who was put into office merely, and he was not removed, but he was put into office merely as a placeholder, right? Somebody who would, he was old, he was reliable, he was a convinced Soviet, and I think that they realized in 1985 or so, when Shernenko was on death's door, that this was a huge mistake, because while Shernenko was reliable and controllable, he was incompetent, and the Soviet Union was still going through a malaise. It couldn't really grow economically. There was a lot of lethargy at the top. There was a lot of disillusionment throughout society, and including within the leadership. So what did they do? Once Shernenko croaked, they chose a much younger, much more dynamic, and much more reformative person in Mikhail Gorbachev, and the rest is history. The system started to collapse. There was unfortunately Chernobyl. There was, the different stages that led to the actual collapse of the Soviet Union. So you don't necessarily need outside pressure in order to collapse an unfair system like what happened in collaborationist France. Sometimes it can come entirely from within. Sometimes the regime itself brings about its own collapse through its incompetence and lack of real flexibility. But you need to think of ways where you can influence people. Then the best way is, first of all, through non-compliance. Another way that you can do it is through demonstrating your non-compliance and encouraging others to do it, and through litigation. In the United States, litigation, I think, does work in many cases. At least you can try. So with that, I'm going to close. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also subscribe to me on BitChute, Odyssey, as well as on Rumble. I don't think Odyssey's live streaming is quite what I thought it would be, so if you saw the live stream yesterday, it wasn't really a live stream. I'm going to try a real live stream today. And other than that, I would like to encourage you to go to sign up to my newsletter, throw me some dollars at Subscribestar, and finally follow me on Minds and Gab, and have a great rest of your day.